Welcome to the UW-Madison Division of Extension's Managing Through Crisis, supporting farmers during challenging times. Today's webinar will focus on beef, grain, and cow markets. My name is Erica Bierstrom, Agriculture Agent for Kewaunee County, and I'll be your moderator today. Our first speaker is Dr. Brenda Botel, Professor and Department Chair of Agriculture Economics and Agricultural Marketing Specialist at UW River Falls. Brenda is an Extension Agricultural Marketing Specialist focusing in the areas of livestock marketing and price analysis. She joined UW Extension in this new position in the fall of 2002. In addition to her background in agricultural and applied economics, she has an interest in international development. Welcome, Brenda.
Thank you. Thanks. So I'm going to talk a little bit today on just the COVID impacts on the protein and the grain markets and what we're seeing here. And then later on, the other speakers are going to expand a little bit on some of the things that I talk about this morning or this afternoon. If you want to go to the first slide. The first thing, just to give you guys as a reminder, there are going to be some impacts. You know, as everyone knows, the COVID-19 aid package, we still don't have a lot of the details on this package. Hopefully some of these will come out tomorrow. As you know, when we look at this, the amounts, there's 16 billion that will be given in direct payments to producers, of which 5.1 billion is going to go for cattle production, 1.6 for hogs, and then when you're looking at row crops, about 3.9 billion. All right, of those, the biggest way in which they're receiving it is those producers are going to receive a single payment that's going to be based on 85% of the price losses that they incurred from January 1 to April 15th. All right, then there's a next second payment that's going to be about 30% of their expected losses from April 15th through the next 2 quarters. Here's where, that's what we do know. Beyond that is where it starts to get a little bit hazy on what the knowledge. So there's no knowledge right yet as far as regarding what price series they're going to use for this compensation and how the paperwork is going to be needed to be done. So there's some self-certification of those losses. And so what that means is that producers do need to keep records and paperwork to demonstrate any losses. So if there's any culling being done or any losses in that way, that needs to be, you may need to make sure that you keep those records to be able to report that. All right. Payment limitations are there at 125,000 per commodity. Overall is 250,000. And then that's going to take into some of the other farm benefits are going to be taken into account. And then supposedly it's going to start sign up as early May and then payments by the end of May. But as I said, right now, being tomorrow, May 1st, hopefully we'll find out some more information on the sign up process. But as of now, I don't really know anything more than this. The biggest thing I want to point out, though, is again, just to make sure that those records are being there, particularly if you're doing any culling of animals. So if you want to go to the next slide. This is just, so just to give you a snapshot of market changes, you know, we've seen a lot of volatility in these market prices. So if you looked at the first date, January 10th was when China's first reported death was on the 11th. Those are across the board prices right there that we saw for the live cattle contract, both the April and October cattle contracts, feeder cattle contracts, hogs, and milk, and then also the equities. If you look all the way down, so I didn't have it as of yesterday, but when we were looking through it through April 13th, you know, some of these prices have come up, but what we saw between January 11th and April 23rd, excuse me, was, you know, we look at those between, you know, depending on where you're at, live cattle contract lost, you know, almost $37 a hundredweight. You know, if you're looking at the October one, it lost almost 26. Feeder cattle lost, if we look at October, $31 per hundredweight. Lean hogs, $24 a hundredweight. So significant losses here. They've had a little bit, yesterday, the markets had come back a little bit more, but they're still significantly down to where they were at in January. This isn't news to anyone, The question becomes on, you know, a little bit how long they're going to stay down. And that really plays into how long the impacts for COVID are. Unfortunately, this is a situation that we've never seen before. So going back and saying, hey, looking at historical precedents in order to be able to determine how long this will last, we don't have any. So some of this is we're just looking at things and it's changing week by week, day by day. If you want to go to the next slide. This was just a plan, and I put this together a couple days ago. It was a really nice graphic to show kind of on plant closures, and it's updated quite often and frequently. It was daily. Now, as we know, it was just showing where the plant closures are. The blue were all of the places where there's plants that have had COVID positive cases. Red were the closures, and the green ones were the ones where they had been closed and have since reopened. All right, so go to the next slide. The biggest thing that we know, which was came about on the 28th, was actually signed on the 29th, was the executive order for the Defense Production Act. All right, this Defense Production Act basically compels packing plants to remain open. They're designated now as critical infrastructure that's needed to feed the U.S. And as part of that, they're saying that the federal government will help provide protective gear for employees as guidance on how this comes about. You know, I'll talk a little bit, and then I'm sure we're going to get more of this later on this. You know, a couple of things on this, the Defense Production Act. It's compelling packing plants to remain open. That doesn't mean, though, that they have to go back to the same capacity that they were prior to COVID. There's still going to be a slowing of the lines as we spread employees out further. That's just going to slow everything down. As more employees don't show up to work, that's going to slow everything down. That doesn't mean they have to run as many shifts as they did previously. So a lot of this is that just because they're open doesn't mean that we're still going to be back at the same capacity that we were before. The biggest thing about this Defense Production Act, though, is that in some ways it takes the authority or the decision out of the hands of the local governance of whether or not some of these plants would be shut down, and as said, okay, we're gonna usurp that. The federal government is mandating that they stay open. So that's one of the big things here, because you saw some of the local governance in some of these cities were mandating that these plants close. If you want to go to the next slide. So as I said, the plant closures, market impacts on it, duration of it, you know, so the plants, just because we have this mandate, we don't know when all of the plants are going to be back up. So we don't know exactly, I don't know yet when these plants are going to start opening up again. You know, just because they open up, then too, as I said, slow down versus closure, you know, yes, we might not have the plant being closed. It doesn't necessarily mean that that plant is going to be open at the capacity that it was previously. All right, it most certainly probably will not be. And so it might not be anywhere near the capacity. So as you look at and this is with Worthington, Minnesota one, where they were just announcing today, they're going to open back up. But they're opening up basically not for the production of meat on some of these, but as for a location for euthanization of some of the hogs that are there. So it's not necessarily an indication that everything is going to go back to normal. The other is that from a marketing component, it makes it a little interesting, because when you have a plant shut down, so I'll use hogs as an example right now, you know, so if I say, you know, slaughter capacity is roughly 500,000 head per day, so about 2.5 million per week, and we have shut down X amount, I can sit down and say, this is the amount of, I can go back and look and say, okay, here's the potential bottleneck that we're going to have. When you have a plant slowing, I don't know what they're running at. So I can't necessarily, they might be that they have a 20,000 head facility capacity, and maybe they're only operating at 3,000, or maybe they're operating at 18,000. I'm not going to know that until later. So it makes some of these even a little bit more of a challenge. And I think I caution producers to, just because this is here, so that they think like, gosh, everything's going to go back to normal. That's not necessarily the way it's going to happen. All right, so we will still see some of these bottlenecks in certain situations, particularly when we're looking at hogs. All right, that's the bigger concern right now. That's kind of the situation that we're seeing right now in the plant closures. And we'll get more of that, I'm sure, later. If you want to go to the next point. When we look at stress points in the marketing system, then, some of the things that we're getting questions on is that, are we going to have this food shortage? Is there going to be not enough meat? Why are we seeing some of this? First is to remind people that there's been a shift in the way in which the marketing system is having to operate. So there's a shift from food service to retail grocery. The U.S. marketing system, the U.S. processing and animal protein system is very specialized. We have a cow-calf segment, we have a feedlot segment, we have a processing segment. And then even in that processing segment, for the most part, every plant doesn't produce all of the same things, doesn't produce all of the same products. And even within that plant, they produce hundreds of different products. All right. And so we have really different markets. We have a retail market, we have like a food service market, and we have an export market. As we're shifting all of this, when we get very specialized, that's a really good thing on the one hand, that it allows marketing margins to be smaller. And remember that processing, there is huge economies of scale for size of processing. All right, so without that size of those processing there, then basically that margin is going to be even bigger. And when you have the larger that marketing margin is, that basically means that the higher the retail price that you will be paying and the lower the farm price the producer will be receiving. All right, it doesn't mean that they're just taking all that profit. It's that there's costs there involved. And if you don't have those large economies of scale, then those costs are greater. Just as an example, when you have very large processing units, they can create product, and because now they have enough volume, they can actually sell that volume for some value. If you're at a smaller locker plant, a lot of that offal is just going to be disposed of. It's not going to have value. And so because of that, then there's a disposal cost rather than a recouping of the cost of some of the product. And that's where I say that then eventually that cost gets pushed out to retail prices and to farm prices. All right. The other point that we're seeing in the marketing system is just labor availability and health challenges that were there. So as we know, a lot of these, as they go through and work and we mandate that plant stays open, you still have to be able to have the labor there and the labor that wants to come to work and be able to be safe. All right, so there's already challenges in that. That's just another stress point that we're seeing in the marketing system. If you want to go to the next one. So as I said, some questions I'm getting is there going to be this food shortage? And if you look at a lot of places, it's like, oh, there's famine that we're going to have. I think that's a little extreme given at this point. I just want to point out some questions that I keep getting are on cold storage. These are graphs that were produced by NAS. So what we have is, just to show you from the last cold storage report, which was April 22nd, frozen poultry was up 4% from the previous month. So, but it's down 2% from 2019. All right, when we break that out into chicken stocks were down slightly month over month, but they were up 15% over 2019. Turkey was up 14% month over month, but that was down 17% from 2019. All right, when we look at beef, then what we saw was that the total red meat was down about 2% month over month, but overall it's up 7% over where we were at in 2019. Some of that is from beef being up 2% month over month and 11% higher beef in cold storage than what we had in 2019. And pork was down, or excuse me, year over year, it was up about 2%. So cold storage was higher a little bit. Will we see some of that breakdown? Then one of the questions is also, what does that mean as far as for availability? If we don't have meat being processed? I didn't do the analysis, but there's an analysis out of Iowa State that came through and kind of looks at red meat. That's about 10 days supply. All right. You know, remember, we're not curtailing and plants are being mandated to open. There's not this potential that there's going to be famine. All right. But what we will see and what we have seen is that, remember, we produce hundreds of different types of cut. So we're very efficient, right? And at a grocery store, you can go in and there's availability of all these different types of cuts, packaged, you know, in all different sizes, both as far as for poundage. We might not necessarily see that availability right now. Anecdotally, you know, I'm hearing even further out east, you know, they've limited SKUs in different areas, but there's still protein products and there's still meat there. All right. So that's on one hand where we're looking at it from an availability source as far as for meat products. If you want to go to the next slide, then when we're looking at cattle on feed. So just to give you, I want to just go over the report. The cattle on feed report came out last Friday. You know, as we saw, marketings in March were up about 13% over what they were in 2019. This was pretty expected. I mean, we saw basically a large amount of those animals being pushed forward in March in anticipation somewhat of some of these issues. And when we think about that those marketings were up 13% over March of 2019, remember, that's even still accounting for the fact that there was a decrease in cattle that were being imported from Canada. You know, there was an extra day of slaughter in March. And so that extra day of slaughter accounts for about 5%, but the rest of that percentage increase is just the additional marketings that we had. All right. When we look at it, April reports, then basically, if we're looking forward a little bit, April reports about 4.5 million head on feed that's been greater on feed for greater than 120 days. So what that means is that those would be typically marketed ideally before May 31st. All right, so that's a little bit where we can see down here on that bottom graph, cattle on feed for over 120 days. That's a little bit less than what we had last year at this point in time for cattle over 120 days, but it's still further above the average than what we have for 14-18. All right, so we've pushed those animals forward to give us a little bit of time. Some of those animals where people have been working to try to slow the growth rate to be able to spread this out over a longer period of time for those animals. So maybe they won't be ready by May, but maybe by the end of June or middle of June to give a little bit more time here. So there's some potential. So on the cattle side, it's going to take a while. We had some of the nationally, we saw some impacts of this, you know, last year with the Holcomb plant being shut down for a period of time. You know, that was one plant for a period of time. You know, this is a bigger impact nationally. But as we saw, we were able to work that through the system. If these plants come up and they become operational again, and depends on where we're at, you know, how long is it going to take for this to work through the system? I have a little bit of optimism on the side for the October cattle price being able to show some improvement here. But if you're looking at that June one, it's just too close for me to be able to say, based off of any historical knowledge, of whether or not I would see any impact, because these things are changing so quickly. Whether or not we see an improvement in that June one will really depend a lot on how quickly these plants come up and at what capacity. And again, I'm not going to know that capacity until a month after the fact, after the slaughter's already been occurring. If you want to go to the hogs, the next slide. When we look at hog slaughter, When we look at the hog side is really a bigger concern as far as for bottleneck right now. Hog slaughter is way down. A lot of that has to do with the significant number of plant closures that we had on the hog side. You know, as I said, some of those are coming up. This is the impact here with the hog slaughter. If you remember, you know, we have about a 2.5, it's not quite 2.5, 2 million head capacity for hog slaughter in the United States. We were down to about 2 for, you know, of what the capacity is. So that's a significant change on a weekly basis of what we can actually process. And we already had a large number of hogs that we were needing to process. If you remember any of the, or if you were looking at hog outlook at the beginning of this year, so before any of the impact on COVID, you know, many of the analysts, myself included, were already sitting here and saying by Q4, we were already looking at a bottleneck because we were going to have more hogs than we had capacity for. All right, so this has pushed this forward some, quite a bit forward. The thing is, hopefully by Q4, we are back with all of the capacity. But, you know, and we potentially by then will have culled quite a few of those animals. You know, that's the unfortunate thing. We are seeing a lot of culling occurring in the hog industry right now. You know, remember culling market hogs, you know, is sad, is very, very sad. You know, it's a lot of costs that are included in those animals that they're not going anywhere, you know, but that doesn't do anything longer term as far as for helping ease this bottleneck. You know, it's the sows or the feeder pigs that's going to help ease the bottleneck later on if we don't get capacity back up to where we were at prior to COVID. If you want to go, so from a price perspective, I'm not nearly as optimistic on the hog side. You know, potentially, you know, we might see some improvement in the Q4 for hogs if we're looking at, if we do end up with greater sow and feeder pig losses here, and if the capacity comes back up, we might be to the point where we're about $10 per hundredweight less than what we were in 2019. But that's still making a lot of assumptions on the cull rate and on the capacity being fully back. If you want to go to the next slide, just to give you a little bit on corn here, you know, corn COVID impacts, you know, a lot of the impacts for corn aren't necessarily directly related to the COVID situation, but indirectly so because of ethanol. But I do want to point out ethanol production. It's stabilized somewhat now, but if you looked through here, our ethanol production was up 2.5% through the end of March. From March, then it's dropped by half in those 4 weeks. So this was the week ending of April 17th. Last week, it was still at like 567. I'm not exactly sure on that number. I just saw it, barrels per day. So in those 5 weeks, then we've dropped. So what that means is that, you know, prior to that, we were at over 1,000 barrels per day. Now we're at 563,000 barrels per day. That's a significant decline in ethanol production. We saw some of that being accounted for already back in the WASO that was given by looking at ethanol production, corn used for ethanol production being decreased by 375 million bushels for this marketing year. Not all of that was accounted for in the increase in a carryover, because when we have less of ethanol being produced, we also have limited the amount of distillers grains that is available, which is a big protein that is used in feed rations. So there's been a lot of nutritionists have been having to do a lot of work in order to be able to accommodate for a change from distillers grains to other forms of corn. All right, so there's been that. So some of that decrease in ethanol being used for corn production went back into corn being used for feed. That's why we didn't see quite as much. A lot of this ethanol production though, even, yes, we are driving less on account of COVID. And so because we are driving less on account of COVID, there is less of a demand for ethanol because there's less of a demand for fuel. But also remember that a lot of the oil prices dropped not necessarily because of the decrease in the driving that is related to the amount for COVID. It had to do with the arguments between Russia and Saudi Arabia on whether or not Russia would be forced to limit their crude oil production. When they said that they were not going to, when they refused to limit their output, that's when we saw oil futures basically crash. So they went limit down March 9th and have been we're going down since then. So if you look at that, they started June futures crude oil prices were $61.46 on January 6th. They were $10.32 last Friday. All right. And they had been down further than that. Now, that plays into a lot then of that ethanol production. All right. That the lower miles does because we don't have to have as much of an ethanol production on that. So that all plays into it a little bit, plus also just demand as others are building it. We did see this week finally that some of those ethanol stocks have dropped some. So that gives some hope now for ethanol production to potentially start to gear up again, but it might be a little while still. But that gives at least a little bit of a bullish news for corn. Other than that, there's really not a lot of bullish news for corn. When we look at production right now, we are on track to be about 50% planted by the end of this week. Eastern part of the Corn Belt is having a little bit of weather, but we still everything looks pretty good. So there's between ethanol production, exports being down as well, there's not a lot of bullish news with the exception that little bit that ethanol stocks dropped a little bit. So I'm not super bullish on the corn price. If you want to go to the soybeans. Regarding soybeans, then when we went back to the March planting intentions, they were for 83.5 million acres. We might see this. If we can keep soybean acres under 85 million acres, then there's a little bit of potential for bullish. If it's higher than that, and based off of discussions with individuals, I think what we're seeing is that there might have been a lot more shifting from corn to soybeans given price projections in March. And so hopefully we can still keep it under 85 million and there wasn't that much of a shift between the soybean and corn. All right. Some of the potentials that we had, crush is still very good. Chinese also bought late last week, trying to add to their state reserves. They don't have to buy that much. Anticipated at max, if they bought it all from the United States, which isn't going to happen. All right, that would be 333 million bushels to add to their state reserves. Now, as I said, that's not all going to happen because remember the Brazilian real is exceptionally weak. So that gives a price advantage then to Brazilian soybeans, which are just getting done. However, there is a potential, if you go back and remember way back from beginning of this year when this was big news, was the phase one agreement with China and that agreement and their potential to buy all of those goods. This would help the Chinese meet that trade expectation. And the unfortunate part is given the price point right now and given the real, they can buy those beans at a lower price and still meet that price objective. So overall, that's why I say we won't get all 10 million metric tons, being bought from the US that the Chinese are trying to do, but a big chunk I do think will come here. The other, so we have some bullish side of this, and because of the increased crush, the biggest thing is that is going to be what do we end up as far as for acres. What that means is that, I do think that there's still quite a bit of potential to be able to see some price increases for soybeans later on this summer. That is, if you go, mine is just questions. I don't know if you wanted to, if we were going to take questions now or if we were going to wait until the end for everybody.
I think we have time for maybe one question just for now. This is actually a question I think we'll pose to everyone, but looking at 8 to 12 months from now, however, whatever normal we'll be back to by then, how do farmers or lenders or anybody in agriculture prepare for these changing times, not just reacting to what's going on right now?
Wow. Yeah. So I get to take the first shot at this, huh? 12 months, what will reality be like in a year? I mean, that's a big if. So let's just say COVID is no longer of a concern. Let's start with that base assumption. All right. What we would have been seeing already was a lower decrease in beef production, which I think will still translate. We will see even lower pork production. So if we can get back to normal, if we can get processing up to normal and people can go back to work, there's potential for some slight increases. The biggest thing on the protein side is that recession tendency is going to keep the ability for those prices to go up too much, particularly on the side for beef. As we have a recession, it impacts beef prices, which means cattle prices. Recessionary tendencies, macroeconomic conditions affect beef prices more than they do any of the other proteins, just simply because it's the highest price protein. And so restaurants, as we saw go back a decade when we saw that last recession, 2008, 2009, in order to entice people to come out to eat, they want to have those lower menu prices, and those lower menu prices typically aren't beef cuts. So how quickly the economy recovers is going to have a greater impact for those beef and those cattle prices than it will for the hog prices per se. So that's the impact there. The other is if we want to, from the side of corn, 12 months from now, I'm going to say as I said, we're going back. So we have gasoline consumption being used. People are still driving miles. So there will be an increased demand for ethanol that should leave us to going back to where we can be increasing that ethanol production, which increases that corn demand a little bit. If that's a worldwide phenomena, then that's going to increase that overall, and we should see exports go up. So that is a little bit more of a bullish tendency from the demand side, but we're still going to have, if we produce all the corn that we said we're going to, and we have a good production year, we're still going to have a huge supply on corn. So there's not a lot of upward potential for corn. What do I think from, and I realize this is a longer answer, the biggest thing I would say from like corn and grain is that, production is that from a farm producer, from the producer's point, is that we look at prices, right? Because that's our revenue. But remember, all of your profit isn't necessarily from those prices alone. It is a combination of the price that you receive for the product, as well as crop insurance and any of those farm programs. This year, hopefully you have some crop insurance as far as for the harvest price crop insurance, if you've included some of that in there, as well as those farm production prices. From a corn and soybean production point, if they're taking advantage of those others, I don't want to say the income is going to be great, but it shouldn't be as bad as what's expected if the prices continue to keep going down. All right, because of the combination of those products. If you don't, and you're reliant completely on revenue, then it's going to be a bit of a different challenge.
All right, well, thank you. We have a couple of other questions. I think maybe we'll try to sneak them in at the end. And if we can't get them in today, then I will send you those questions and maybe we can respond back to everybody who registered today. All right. Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Botel. Our next speaker is Kurt Larson, President and CEO of Equity Cooperative Livestock Sales Association. Kurt assumed the role of President and Chief Executive Officer at Equity Cooperative about a year ago. He has been with Equity for almost 7 years, initially hired as the Director of Human Resources and later as Vice President of Administration before assuming his current role. Prior to joining Equity, Kurt spent 14 years at Accelerated Genetics, with his last 8 years there as Vice President of Finance and Chief Financial Officer. After receiving a bachelor's degree in accounting from UW-River Falls, he worked for Hormel Foods as a livestock accounting and invoicing manager before returning to Wisconsin and earning his CPA license from the state of Wisconsin. Kurt resides just outside of Reedsburg with his wife and 4 children. When he's not helping his in-laws with their dairy and beef operation, he and his family raise sheep and goats. So let's welcome Kurt.
Thank you, Erica. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're seeing in marketing livestock through this current situation we're in. So if you want to go to the next slide, I guess a little background on Equity here to get started so everybody kind of understands my frame of reference as we move through this. Equity is a farmer producer-owned cooperative. We were created basically to assist in marketing livestock nearly 100 years ago. So we've got some experience at this. On the next slide, talks a little bit about how we do that. So we're providing services today through both our auction barns or sale barns, as well as a couple of collection points and buying stations. And then we do offer some private treaty marketing as well, kind of farmer to farmer type thing without coming through the sale barn. So we've got some field reps that are in contact with producers pretty regularly, identifying what their needs are, what they're looking for, and then also working with other producers to identify what they have available and negotiating deals. We also do direct marketing, typically directly to packers, either on a contract basis or on a grade and yield basis. And then we do have a few other services we can offer as well. We do offer some order buying. So if producers are looking for a certain kind of cattle but can't attend to market, we've got individuals that can go and identify cattle and bid on their behalf. We also have some commodity brokers in the office here that can provide risk management services. If producers are looking to take advantage of options or hedging or that type of thing, those individuals are fully licensed brokers that can help put the strategy together and place the orders and advise clients and that type of thing. We've also got a lending, wholly owned credit corp subsidiary to provide lending to producers as well if they're looking for agricultural lending assistance. On the next slide, kind of talks about our auction markets. We have 11 facilities in Wisconsin, 1 in Iowa. And a couple things to mention. Auction proceeds are issued from a custodial account. So basically this is an account that's audited regularly by Packers and Stockyards Division of USDA. We're required to keep funds in these accounts when checks are issued. So basically every day when we issue checks, we've got the money already in the account. So producers are not at risk receiving a bad check for cattle that come through the auction. The other things you'll notice, an auction check will disclose the actual sale price of the animal and any related expenses. And really, the auction is the key tool for the price discovery in the cash traded livestock markets. Next slide, please. So just a couple other things to note. Equity typically does not own any livestock. So when you see livestock sold at an equity auction, these are not auction operator livestock. These are all producer livestock. And the same thing with bids in the auction. Equity typically does not own any livestock, so we're not bidding. Again, we do provide that order buyer service. So from time to time, you may see an employee bidding, but again, he's got an order and bidding on behalf of a producer at the time. Next slide. So a couple of quick stats. In 2019, Equity transacted, basically marketed 695,000 animals with a gross value of just over $425 million. And those came from 26,000 different producers. Basically, we issued just over 175,000 checks. So a little background on what our volume has been. On the next slide. So this is my disclaimer. This current situation has been very fluid and we're seeing regular changes. We've seen things changing daily for just over a month now. These presentations can get pretty hard to give if we're preparing ahead of time, and then as quick as things are changing, by the time we give the presentation, it's not always real timely anymore. A few things we do know with this virus, it seems to affect people a little bit differently. There's a variety of symptoms with a varying degree of severity. We've seen different states and even some cities developing their own approach to the situation. Likewise, all the packers are approaching it a little bit differently. And then each plant seems to be affected maybe at a different time or in a different way, maybe than what we expect or what we've seen in other areas. Next slide. So how equity has approached this situation. Again, as a producer-owned cooperative, we remain open to assist producers in continuing to market their livestock. That has required us to make some operational changes. So we've got some schedule changes. We encourage people to continue to monitor our website for our sales schedules. We have a couple of sales that have been suspended. Our Marion location, the difficult decision was made, but we've suspended all activity there. For those that are familiar with that sale, they may understand a little more about it, but those that are not familiar, our Marion market ran a Monday evening sale. And so that evening we would have truckers and buyers who had been at 4 or 5 different sales earlier that day coming into that one facility on Monday evening. And then on Tuesday, they're all going back out to different facilities. And in reviewing that, we really felt that that was a huge risk for some transmission of this virus if somebody at one market were to be exposed to it and bring it into that location, and then it disseminates out from there. And then in looking at where that's located, we've got 3 or 4 markets not too far away. We believe we're able to serve most of those producers without a lot of difficulty at one of the other locations. Our market manager at that location is still in the area. He continues to take calls. He's been pretty key in helping some producers get cattle to other locations and helping them with timing and that type of thing. So we continue to provide service there, just in a little bit different format. Our Barron market, they had a Monday sale and a Wednesday sale. Their Monday sale has been suspended for the time being. When we reviewed it, a lot of the producers that were marketing on Monday were also marketing on Wednesday. So after some discussion with them, reduces their risk as well at only coming to the market 1 time a week, half the exposure. And then it frees up some staff for us on Mondays in the event that we get into a position where we've got an issue at another market where low staff, we can borrow some of those individuals to help out. And obviously, as our volumes decrease, our sale times change a little bit. So in order to keep the day flowing and keep the attention of the buyers, we've shortened up some of our sale times. So again, if you're looking to bring cattle in, I encourage you to check the website and see what time the sale is starting, and if there's a change to any of the start times for any of the different types of cattle. We also had to limit admittance into our buildings. So we were forced to go to the step of no spectators. And unfortunately, I know a lot of producers like to watch their cattle sell. Unfortunately, that's just more risk of exposure, the more people in and out of the facility. So for the safety of our employees, as well as the buyers, we've made the decision to close down to spectators. Under some of the governmental orders that were issued, the cafes were all forced to close as well. So again, that's a temporary change. We get through this thing, hopefully we can open that back up. We have made some accommodations. We are asking producers to drop their livestock and leave the facility. Obviously, we understand the purpose of equity is to basically convert those cattle to cash for producers. And obviously, waiting for the mail isn't always the most appealing option. So our markets are working with those producers that would like to make arrangements, give the office a call at the market and make some arrangements as to when you could come back and pick your check up. We're working through some of those issues as well, but markets are happy to assist those producers with that. And then the other change, if you've dropped livestock off at a market, you may have noticed in the past when you've came in, we print off the dock slip with what you've dropped off, and there's some disclosures on there where we require a signature on. We've worked through it with USDA and the state, and they've allowed us to take a verbal disclosure from the individual dropping the livestock off, and then our employee will actually sign their name and make a note of the person that made the disclosure to them. Again, it's less risk passing back and forth dock slips and pens and trying to get those signatures. So it's all about safety. I'm really trying to limit that exposure, but yet continue to do business. Through the whole thing, I find myself doing more and more media presentations kind of like this, or interviews with different media. And really, I'm just trying to aid in the communication and help explain to people how our operation has changed and explain we're still here to provide the same service. It just looks a little bit different, but we're trying to accomplish the same thing yet. Next slide, please. So we get a lot of questions. What can producers do through this situation? Obviously, the first thing we're telling them is to remain calm. We fully realize that's easier said than done. But some of the key things are to avoid making those heat of the moment decisions. There's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of misinformation. Some of that information can get people excited and they're trying to guess what to do next. Again, we need to digest that information a little bit and think about the decisions. Things seems to change very quickly. So again, decision you might make today might change when you know what you're going to learn tomorrow. So again, it's difficult to keep up with these changes, but it's very important to try to stay on top of this. Next slide. So, in saying that, we're encouraging people to educate themselves and again, get good information. There's a lot of media out there that's trying to sensationalize stuff and put a little different spin on it. So we're encouraging people to really ask what the rest of the story is and see through some of the media spin. Consider multiple sources of information. Don't rely on one source of information to be your only source, and really try to find good sources within the agricultural industry. A lot of those reporters they vet their information, they vet their sources, and they don't want to get caught putting bad information out. So, we've got a lot of good sources here in our ag industry, and I encourage people to rely on those. And also we encourage people to reach out to a trusted professional for assistance. Your local marketing agency, our market managers are happy to take conversations and have discussions and help people put a plan together. Your local banker be another good source. If you've got a tax accountant, they might be a good source. The other place I direct a lot of people is the UW Farm Center. I know they're an awesome source of information. They've got a lot of knowledgeable people there, and good place to go if you're needing somebody to talk to or looking for some information as well. Next slide. So again, understand that information you have. What is it really telling you? Where did it come from? And how accurate is it? And does it really fit with the other sources of information you have? If you've got 3 or 4 sources of information and one's kind of in left field and the rest are all pretty uniform and similar, question the one that's not lining up with the rest. They either have a different source of information or they're not really keeping up with everybody else. So important things to keep in mind. Next slide. And then once you have the information, you know what you've got, then think through your situation, talk to that trusted professional, evaluate what your options are. Don't be afraid to make a list of the pros and cons of each one. Ask questions on things you don't understand. And then the big thing is really to consider the long-term effects of your decision. A lot of times we make decisions based on the here and now and don't realize what the effect is down the road. We've had some people lately that, have had beef cull cows to market and the market just hasn't been where they wanted it. We've been trying to hold slots for the dairy cattle that need to be culled. So we've had a couple of individuals I know that put their cull cows back out with the bull. And, the question was, do you realize that in the short term, you don't have to market it. You might not take a loss on it, but now you've created additional cull cows for next year. You've created additional calves for down the road. And if you're trying to shrink your herd, that may not be accomplishing what your goals are. So, and the other thing is, a lot of people can have trouble making decisions at times like this. And when you don't make a decision, it's essentially the same as deciding to do nothing. So things really don't get better if you're not making some changes. So you got to keep in mind, I know it's tough, but you need to be making some decisions and taking some action. Next slide. So the question is, how do producers really conduct business through this situation? We're encouraging producers to continue to market livestock. Now we're saying slow down, don't maybe market what you would have. You probably can't market what the same volume you would have in the past. There probably just aren't enough slots available, but we still need to be moving some livestock. We don't know how long the situation might last. We really don't know the effect on the slaughter capacity as we work through this thing, or even when we come out the other side. We're not sure what consumer demand is going to do in the next couple of weeks while we work through this, or even a couple months from now when we come out the other side of it either. And again, we don't know what the effect is going to be on the overall economy. So it's important to keep marking, some of the things we do know there's a lot of people out there that need to eat. We know there's a lot of livestock that need to be processed. And we know, the processors are working hard to keep some amount of capacity open. So it's important that we continue to move some livestock through the chain wherever we can. We're encouraging producers to reach out to their local market, talk to the market manager. Those market managers are the guys that are talking to the people buying in their market every day. They know what the buyer has for an order. They know what their capacity is. They have an idea where the price is. So those are the guys that really can help producers put a plan together as to when and where to market something and how many to bring at a time. So we're really encouraging conversations with those individuals. Next slide, please. So a couple strategies on how to do this. Again, we're encouraging smaller groups. Instead of taking everything on one day, maybe you split up and go a couple different days, maybe even look at a couple different locations. Like I said, things are changing quickly. So the situation at a plant may be different on Wednesday than it was on Monday. Different locations have different buyers represented, different buyers source their cattle from different locations. So again, a buyer at one market may get some cattle from another place and another buyer may get most of their cattle out of the market. So there's some value in looking at a couple different markets as well. Next slide. So again, getting back to equity and what can a marketing agency really help you with? A few things we wanted to point out. We can represent you and your livestock to multiple buyers basically at the same time. Our staff is in contact with several buyers each day representing different companies and different plants. We can save you considerable amount of time as opposed to the individual producer having to make all those calls. And again, we deal with these buyers on a regular basis. We know what their expectations are. They know what our terminology is. Oftentimes producers that don't work with buyers on a regular basis, they haven't developed that same relationship. So some time saving there. We understand the different packer programs. Different packers at different plants kind of have a different program, a different kind of cattle they're looking to process through there to fit the orders that they have. Our staff's been doing this for a long time. We understand what the different packers and different plants are looking for. We can look at a producer's cattle and help them figure out what model they'll fit the best and where they might get the best value. And again, we can help sort those and match those up. And again, oftentimes, even though cattle come from the same farm, they're not all the same and maybe shouldn't all go to the same plant. So we can help get that sort done and maximize the value of the cattle at the same time. Next slide. And I guess that gets us to the end of what I had prepared for today. So if you had some questions you wanted me to take a stab at, or we want to wait till the end.
We have one question. Is there right now a kind of cow that you'd rather not see, that maybe isn't going to get through the market, maybe isn't going to have an end location to go to? Like if there's cull cows that are maybe on the thin side or heavy cull cows or something in that range, or is there a type of cow that maybe the farmer should just kind of hold back on right now and just sort of wait to see how this market and the packing situation is going to go?
So, up to yesterday when I was talking to some of our managers, we don't really have any particular type of animal we're having difficulty finding bids on. So, I don't know that we really have one at this point. Obviously some of them need to go a little sooner than others. So again, that's kind of an individual farm process to kind of prioritize the ones you need to get rid of the soonest, probably not being able to take everything you'd like to on a given day right now with the limited capacity. But we've been able to move pretty much everything we've seen in the last couple of weeks. So I don't know that there's really anything I would say, not to bring.
So the big picture is to just spread them out a little bit more and not try to send them all on one day.
That's what we're seeing. Yeah. And it seems to work pretty well. We haven't had any real train wrecks yet. And, if you're spreading them out, you're not having a train wreck on a whole load. It's a small number and you can hopefully recover that on the next sale or see what we learn at that sale. But again, it has a lot to do with how quick things are changing, but we've been able to do a pretty good job on lower volumes with holding the prices. And, we're seeing a fairly tight price range on most of the cattle. Not the big disparity we were afraid we would see. If you have a lot of cattle, they may start pretty strong and by the end you run out of demand and you get a pretty big spread on the price, but things have been pretty close together, pretty tight on the smaller volumes we've been seeing.
All right. We don't have any other questions right now, but we'll wait to see if any come in before the end here today. Thank you, Kurt. We
All right, thank
appreciate
you.
you speaking today. Our final speaker today is Steve Van Lannen, President and Chief Operating Officer at American Foods Group in Green Bay. Steve has over 25 years experience in the food industry, actively managing nearly all aspects of a food company with emphasis in operations, quality assurance, technical services, and cattle procurement. Steve has worked with American Foods Group since 2008 and has been in his current role since 2016. Steve was born and raised on a dairy farm in northeast Wisconsin, and he holds a Bachelor's of Science degree from UW-Madison. Welcome, welcome, Steve.
Hi, Erica. This is Amber. I'm trying to unmute him, but it's not allowing me to unmute him.
Is
I
it
can't
unmuted now?
unmute it. We can hear you.
Could you hear me all along or not?
No.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Must have been on my end. I apologize. I didn't have time to put together a presentation today, a PowerPoint presentation with everything going on. In fact, I think it took Erica a week to even track me down. My thoughts for today were to walk through what's happened since the beginning of March when all of our world started to change, walk through some of the changes in demand, supply, what's happening in plant operations. And my goal in that is to hopefully give everyone a better perspective on how the commodity markets are acting and reacting due to these changing situations, and give us perhaps a glimpse of what we might expect in the future. American Foods Group is a privately owned, family-owned company, primarily in cow and bull slaughter. We're based in Green Bay, Wisconsin. We have a slaughter plant in Green Bay that harvests cows, bulls, as well as it's the only plant of ours that does graded cattle, primarily Holstein steers. We have a cow and bull plant in Minnesota, cow and bull plant in South Dakota, as well as one in Nebraska. We have 3 ground beef processing facilities, one in Green Bay, one in Omaha, and one in Sharonville, Ohio. And we also do some further processing, a little bit of sausage manufacturing, and fully cooked protein items in Washington, Ohio, and in South Dakota. As I said, I was going to kind of walk through where all this started to happen in early March, when COVID came onto the scene, and what that really meant to demand at first, right? That's where we saw the first impact with food service, with stay-at-home orders, travel restrictions. Food service basically closed overnight, right? It was flipping of a switch, and as what's happened in recent years, meals away from home were more common than meals at home, and over 50%. You take that out of the picture, the supply chain on the retail side was not ready for that surge, and also you had some panic buying of proteins as well as other items, and it really put a tremendous surge for a couple of weeks on the retail distribution system, right? We heard the stories of trucks not being able to unload for days because these warehouses just weren't prepared. Then as that started to unfold and the retail supply chain catching up, we really saw boxed beef inventories grow. Not trim items, not ground beef necessarily, but middle meats, end cuts that would typically go into food service. Retail supply chain couldn't take it up. Plus, we had all of that food service inventory coming into secondary markets, and so we saw prices tank. Then we moved into early April, and I really think we saw a leveling off of supply demand, especially in the beef business. Retail was getting their needs filled. Of course, packers made drastic changes in the plants as far as what they were saving. Maybe some of those end cuts at that time then were going into the grinder to keep up with that ground beef supply demand and keep lean fat ratios correctly in line. And then the cattle prices certainly saw that effect of all these changes in the several weeks in that. We saw low cattle prices, which is, as Kurt alluded to, that marketing signal actually held where producers could hold back, whether that was ranchers maybe turning some cows back out on the grass. Certainly the dairy cull was happening. That certainly freed us all the industry to process more of those dairy cattle, and it was kind of moving along at an even pace. Then we started to see plants go down. Certainly plants were losing production capacity. There's a lot of plants around the country that went to two-shift operations and ended up going to one shift just because so many employees that were out not being able to work. So now we started to see a little different shift. It was really the supply side was holding up the situation due to the reduced hours in the plants. Plants at that time, obviously, we had to take into account a lot of other things, screening of employees, PPE equipment, social distancing, adding break room areas. There were a whole lot of effort and expenses put into, keeping employees safe and keeping the plants operating. And as Kurt alluded to, we certainly, each plant has taken a different approach and situations change sometime on an hourly basis. Specifically here in Wisconsin, we've, as I said, we have some Western plants. We certainly, we were running a good capacity and still are in those plants. And so we certainly shifted some of the dairy cow inventory to those other plants, where we can certainly leave some beef cows to the west out on grass. Situation in Green Bay is you've certainly seen a lot of headlines, I'm sure. Our plant in Green Bay is operating at about 60% capacity, and that's just due to the fact that we've got employees that are either tested positive. More importantly, though, it's the tracing, community tracing. So we have a lot of employees that are on quarantine because they've been exposed to someone who's tested positive in the community. That's probably our biggest situation in labor, and to some insight as to why every plant is a little bit different. All these plants are very labor intensive, but there's certainly certain skilled positions, certain areas of the plant that if you have a lot of employees out in that area, it may prevent the plant from running at all. So it's not just the fact that if you're missing 30% of your employees, you go down to 30% less production. It may not be the case depending upon the skill level of those positions and whatnot. So as I said today, we're in Green Bay is operating at about 60%. We expect that to probably maintain at that level for the foreseeable future, which is the next week or so. By then, we should start to see a large volume of those employees that were out on quarantine. We're hoping that they can get back into work and we can up our production levels. Some of the current situations today that's really impacting is because of the large fed cattle plants, some closed, some going to 50% production. We're in a situation where there's absolutely no fat trim available. So this lean meat that we need to blend to make a ground beef blend of 73s or 80% lean, there just is no fat trim available. So we've actually, because of lack of raw material, we've kind of reduced some hours. We had run 7 days a week in our grinding plants for a while, and now we just don't have the raw material to make that happen. So it's going to take some of those larger fed cattle plants to come back online to get that evened out. So we've seen now this last week, we've seen unprecedented increases in the price of 50% lean trim. The lean meat has been very flat because of the fact that no one has any fat meat to blend. The other interesting thing that I would add is a major impact to costs, and Brenda talked about the ethanol industry. A major factor, a major byproduct of the ethanol industry is CO2. And meat packers of all types use a large amount of CO2. We use CO2 to chill product and bottom injection in our ground beef. It's for frozen ground beef and for fresh. It's a major impact to our plants. For a while, there were a little bit of disruptions. We were able to get CO2, although we were probably having to haul it from further away. But now we're seeing major surcharges on CO2 because the CO2 distributors just don't have a clear picture of what their supply situation is, and it's really driven by the ethanol plants reducing and maybe shutting down. So that's just some of the added costs. And clearly, as Brenda noted, these plants are very dependent on volume to keep our efficiencies and our costs in line. And so when you take out 40% capacity on a plant, it certainly drives your per head cost in a very different direction. There were some questions that were submitted ahead of time, and I'll answer a few of those here if I didn't cover them already. I know Brenda covered the freezer capacity. I know Department of Ag kind of did a survey here a couple of weeks ago of Wisconsin freezer capacity, and at that time it was estimated at probably 85-90% capacity. Anecdotally, obviously with the changes that we've seen in the last couple of weeks with major plants being down, there has been more, the freezers that we work have certainly relayed to us that they have more product going out than coming in. So there's always some lag on getting the true reports of freezer inventories, but I would tell you anecdotally right now, they're certainly coming down. So I think that's a good thing in the sense that we can get these plants back up into production. If we do need to divert things to the freezer, that's certainly a viable option moving forward. How long is this disruption going to continue in the meat supply? Crystal ball is pretty foggy at this point. I would clearly, if we look at the experience in some other countries, the experience of even in some various states and communities around this country, I would think the impacts on some of these plants are probably, to some degree, I would say it's maybe 30 days. And I don't think it's as bad as it is now, but it'll take time, right? We won't be able to these plants don't come back to 100% production overnight. There was a question asked if the plants, can get resumed to production levels of pre-COVID with all of the social distancing that we have to do in the plants, the other measures that we take to keep employees safe in the plants. And I really think we can. It's really a factor of not having enough labor that's able to be at work right now. But once we get everyone back, we've implemented those measures that we can operate safely and be at full capacity. So I think that's not a concern long term. These production levels, we just need to get employees back. With that, I don't think I have anything else. I'm certainly available to answer any questions that we might have.
All right. I think in the news, we're seeing a lot of stories about Brazilian beef coming into the U.S. What are what are you seeing with that? Is that true?
There's always been a large amount of imported meat in this country, and it's primarily lean trim, right? Because our fed cattle production in this country is such a large amount that there's always too much fat trim, and we need more lean than we can domestically supply. So there's always been a large amount of imported trim brought into the country, whether that be Brazilian, Australian, New Zealand. In recent years, though, because of some various trade issues, certainly Australia had some drought issues. While some countries, including the U.S., weren't maybe able to go into China or other markets, Brazilian product was able to go into there, so that trade was happening. So actually the imports have been down in the last year or so. I know there's been some headlines of Brazil's prepared to step in and to fill our supply needs. I kind of like, as Kurt mentioned, maybe check your sources on that, but it makes a nice headline. The reality is there's not enough fat trim now to even make that imported lean trim value, because we can't utilize it right now. But there's always been a fair amount of trade in lean trim in this country, imported.
All right, let's see if we can get another question here. So with you typically are taking the cull cows and bulls in Green Bay. With your other facilities, what's the best marketing plan right now for fat cattle and people who are sitting on a lot of animals that maybe haven't moved in a few weeks?
Sure. So we have over 50 salaried cattle buyers around the country that are either visiting farms directly, ranches directly, and certainly working in auction barns every day. We do also take cattle directly at all 4 of our plants. So as we talk about, some of these cows that maybe a little slower, maybe can't handle a couple of different trips through a sale barn, we do have the ability to take cattle in directly. But majority of our cattle are sourced, through auction barns and through direct from producers. As Kurt said, I mean, it's always been our advice to, continue timely marketing. We spread those marketing risks out over time by smaller groups of cattle. Fortunately, we're at a time of the year that the beef cow slaughter culling is not happening as heavily right now. So there's certainly what limited hook capacity there is, at least we can dedicate that more to dairy cows. Our buyers are always, our head buyers at each of our plants are available to be reached out to anytime. I know there's been concerns, is a plant operating? Is a company going to be off the market for a week? Some of that we don't know from day to day, but certainly we try to communicate back through the sale barns and then through our buyers directly of what our capabilities are and kind of where we see the demand being. But timely marketing is important, and they do have the ability to, maybe hold some dry cows back for a minute. It's going to take a little more time for this volatility to flush out of the market, and then we should be some more stable pricing moving forward.
What's the best way for a producer to kind of keep up? I know because everything is changing on a daily basis for you, probably hourly, maybe even by the minute. What is the best way for the farmer to keep track of or kind of follow what's going on and what they should be doing in regards to marketing animals?
Yeah, so reaching out to our head cattle buyers or any of their local buyers that we have, they're certainly available to give input as to what we see the market's doing. And now some days it's just been the question, will we have the availability to take those cattle? So that's, and all the equity barns, our buyers are in there at every sale. And if we end up having to reduce production and we think it's going to affect the market, we certainly reach out to all the sales barns and kind of let them know where we're headed so that they can give the best information to producers as well.
Okay. We have a question. If I don't see any other questions for Steve, thank you so much. Yes, it was a little bit of a challenge to track you down. You are one busy guy, so we greatly appreciate you taking the time today to be on this webinar, because it's a great way for everybody to be up to date right now as to what's going on. I have a question for Brenda. With the CARES Act providing $3.9 billion in assistance to farmers, if you have not sold grain before April 15th, will you still receive assistance, and how will that be calculated?
So that's where I say, apart from what I have right there, we're waiting basically, hopefully tomorrow. A lot of this information is going to come out on the calculations. I don't know what the price points are going to be on how they're determining that, what that loss is. So I'm guessing, and this is a guess, that some more details of this will be coming out tomorrow, and if not tomorrow, very early next week, given that their intention is to be able to distribute this by the end of May. But I honestly don't know. We will be putting out, there's a fact sheet as soon as we get it on the extension. So I'm working on that, as well as Mark Stevenson. When we get that information, It will be on the UW extension information, but as of right now, I can't really give you any more details than what I already have.
Okay, we are running a little bit ahead of time today, so we will be putting up the agenda for next week's webinar. Again, we cannot thank our speakers enough today. We know that it's busy right now and you guys are really strapped for time. So again, we do really appreciate it. We got a special note here from Pam Yankee. She said, the media really appreciates you taking time today as well. So thank you, everybody. I have a couple of other things here. Hang on. So on behalf of UW-Madison Division of Extension, I'd like to thank our speakers today. Thank you to all of our participants as well. You will be receiving a follow-up email with additional resources on for you from today's meeting. If there were any other resources for the participants, we'll make sure you get those. And please take a few minutes to fill out the evaluation linked into the email. It's a good way for us to figure out what we should be doing for the next coming up webinars. We do have one planned for next week. Next week on May 7th, Thursday, May 7th at 1 p.m. It will be called Financial Aid Program Updates and Continuing the Legacy of Agriculture, featuring the speakers Joy Kirkpatrick from the UW Center for Dairy Profitability. She will be speaking on PPP, EIDC, and PUA. Corey Fanslau from Greenstone Farm Credit Services will be speaking on P3 Basics. And of course, the one and only fabulous farm babe, Pam Yankee, will be speaking on the continuing of the legacy of agriculture. So with that, thank you again, everyone. Thank you, our speakers. Thank you to our participants, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Erica.